Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your presence today and welcome to this executive forum organized by the National Mining Association of the United States and the Financial Times. My name is Javier Blas. I'm the commodities editor at the Financial Times, responsible for the coverage of the commodities markets and natural resources industry, mining, oil, gas, agriculture too, at the newspaper. Before we start, please, can I ask you, as I just did, to turn off your mobiles or put it on the silence mode. We don't want to get distracted. I know that some of you need the mobile on, but if you could just put it on silence, much appreciated. This is a fantastic theme for today's event, addressing America's 21st century mineral needs. I will even broaden a bit. It's not just the United States, but it's how we are going to just feed our industry with metals and minerals globally and domestically over the next few years, decades, and generations. And the situation is getting complicated and complicated because the demands are just extraordinary. As the global population increases, we get more richer, and particularly developing countries such as China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and others see an increase on the population, but most importantly, on the size of the middle class. Suddenly, they are demanding refrigerators, cars. One of my colleagues recently wrote a story from Vietnam. Last year, the producers of scooters sold more scooters in Hanoi than all the scooters that were sold in Europe. And a scooter is a lot of metal. It's iron ore. It's steel, obviously, but it's on copper, it's on aluminum, and other metals that need to be produced, need to be extracted, processed, transported, and then delivered to consumers for those new goods. And that's the kind of transformation that we are seeing that I think that is just astonishing, and that's just going to shape the industry for the next few years. It's not only the demand, but also the constraints to produce those metals. I was just last week in Johannesburg on a conference on mining down in South Africa, and it's very remarkable how South Africa, that is one of the most important countries in mining, indeed, his GDP, his mining GDP is the fifth largest in the world. And I was talking there with executives of the industry, and they were telling me, we can't deliver today. We can't deliver what the thermal coal that China needs. We can't deliver the manganese that the steel industry is demanding. The problem is that we cannot transport it to the port. They have a production capacity, they have an export capacity of 90 million tons for thermal coal. However, the country is exporting barely more than 60 million. Why? Well, because the railway is unable to transport more coal. And that problem of transportation, of delivery, is going to be one that is going to be also with us, that is going to be affecting our industry. It's not only that the mining companies are going to need to produce and extract the metals, it's also going to need the help for transportation, and that's going to be a critical challenge. Then the other challenge of our industry is going to be human resources. When I started, and let me just give my personal history. When I started in commodities in 1998, I started in the oil sector. The price of oil was at $8. And my editor asked me why I wanted to be an oil reporter. I was just interested in the Middle East, and I was in a business newspaper, and oil seems to be the right thing to do. But obviously what he recommended to me was that I should be reporting on new technologies on the internet. It was 1998. Google, Yahoo, and all those other companies that they were extremely valuable on the NASDAQ, and today they are worthless or they are not even with us any longer. And if you apply that to journalism, so everyone thought that Google was the future, it was exactly the same for the kids that in the 80s and the 90s were going to undergraduate school, to the college, to study. No one wanted to do mining engineering. No one wanted to do petroleum engineering. And God forbid, no one wanted to be a geologist. And that's what we need today. Again, coming from South Africa, one of the problems that they were telling me is that they don't have nearly enough mining engineers. It's a huge shortage. I was earlier this year in Chile, where there is a huge shortage of mining engineers, and one company, Rio Tinto, was trying to lure some mining engineers from Chile to go to Mongolia. I think they are not getting a lot of applicants, even if they are offering double salaries. But that's the only way they could get the mining engineers to leave Chile and move to Mongolia. They are offering to double their salaries. And that's how critical the shortage is getting into the industry. And when we look at the future of the mining industry here in the United States and worldwide, we need to address the challenge of educate a new generation of engineers, of geologists, executives who could run these companies. Because if I'm not mistaken, the average age of a mining engineer in the United States is around 50, 55 years old. And that's not that I'm a bit younger, but that's just really bad news for the industry. I mean, if you look at the oil industry, the main problem over the last few years to develop new fields have been just finding talent that they could run those fields. So I think that that's going to be a huge problem. And again, if we are able to resolve those problems, and we are able to produce and transport, and we have the talent to develop those resources, then we are going to have to find a way also to work with communities, with the states, and with the federal government here to be able to get all the paperwork done so we can transform those projects into reality. And here, the experience is not very good because no one wants a big industry seen as polluting as mining. And that is the kind of feeling that when you go to communities they have, even communities with very strong links to the mining industry, suddenly they are turning their back into the industry. How Congress is going to react to improve the legislation, how states are going to improve their legislation, and particularly how local communities are going to react to projects, I think that is going to be a critical feature over the next few years on how the industry is able to respond. And beyond all of this, suddenly, with this scarcity of minerals and metals, for the first time we have seen that metals could be used also as a political weapon, something that previously we have never thought about that, or at least myself, I have not thought about that. I know that some people in the 50s and 60s saw it, but for the last 35 years, no one has thought at all about the potential use of metals as a political tool. And suddenly we saw that when China got very angry with Japan for a political dispute that was absolutely unrelated with anything linked to the metals market or the commodity markets, what he did it was to shut down the export of rare earth metals. And that was something that suddenly wake up a lot of people to realize that as we have the experience with oil in the 70s and the Middle East, metals could be also used for political reasons. We have a lot of minerals and metals heavily concentrated on single producers. Rare earth metals, it's very concentrated in China, but we have others, even in smaller amounts. But what happens if governments in Latin America decide that they don't want to export as much copper as they are doing today? What happens if governments in Indonesia decide that they don't want to export as much tin as they are doing today? And the list could continue. And it's not only that it could be used as a political tool, it's that also those countries, as they are evolving, they are trying to clean up the industry. Take the example of antimony and China. China is responsible for almost all the production of antimony in the world. It's a metal that you use. Most likely, they will sell antimony on this carpet. It's used to impregnate fabrics to make fabrics fireproof, delay fires. The price of antimony has gone from about $2,000 a ton, used about 10 years ago, to more than $10,000 today. And it's not because China is restricting the trade of antimony. It's just that it has clamped down on illegal and unsafe mining in the country. So suddenly has closed down by government regulation. That's how they do all things in China. have closed down lots of mines, consolidate the industry, and suddenly it's a huge shortage of the metal. So those are some of the questions that I think we are going to try to address today here. The format of the event is going to be a short introductory remarks from our panelists, and then we will move to a Q&A, myself here in the podium. And as you probably have realized today, I make my life just talking and asking questions, so I could be asking our panelists questions for a long time. But what I would like to do is open to the floor so we can engage on a Q&A, very much as they say on a Davos style, the World Economic Forum. Just the public and our panelists could interact. If you are tweeting or you are following this on Twitter, I'm told that if you do hashtag MNA Forum, you could get the latest on Twitter on what I just said, and also you could contribute. So with that, let me introduce you some of our panelists, and I'm not going to go through their entire biographies you have on your booklets, their names and what they have done, but briefly, I'm going to say some quick words about that. I will start to my right with Roderick Egger, who is professor and director of the Division of Economics and Business at the Colorado School of Mines. I'm very eager to talk to Roderick about the shortages on labor that the industry is facing, but not only that, his views on resources and the resource base here in the United States. Hal Quinn, further to my right, the president and CEO of the National Mining Association. He is the representative of the industry here in the United States, having about 300 members, if I'm not mistaken, across the industry, not only mining companies, but also providers of services, and about 60 companies that they are actually engaged on the extraction of minerals from the United States. It is obviously a very strong force in global mining industry. Further to my right, Colin Hayes, he's a member of the professional staff of the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources in the United States Senate, who has been on that position since 2007, and I'm also very keen to discuss with him legislative measures that they could be in place or ideas that could be coming that it could make the mining industry having an easier life here in the United States. To my left, and not on political reasons, but just on geographical situation, Stephen Duclos, he is the Chief Scientist and Manager of Material Sustainability at GE General Electric Global Research, where he has a fantastic job and has to check the availability and sustainability of all the company's raw material intake to make sure that General Electric, when he's developing his current products, but also thinking about the future, has the right amount and the right availability of minerals and metals. And finally, further to my left, again on geography, not on the political spectrum, we have, sorry, I'm just going to get this right, Frank Garney, who is a founder and president of the Center for Security Policy and acted as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Policy during the Reagan administration, following 4 years of service as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for Nuclear Forces and Arms Control Policy. And obviously, a fantastic voice to talk to us about the global implications of minerals and metals becoming more scarce and also being used as a political weapon, or at least as diplomatic leverage in negotiations between different countries. With that, let me just go to Mr. Quinn and start with asking for some introductory remarks. And what I would like to ask is just give us the overview of how the industry sees the current situation, and particularly how the industry sees his ability here in the United States to grow. What are the barriers? And particularly looking at, are those barriers just that we have lack of staff on the ground, or are those barriers mostly that we have difficulties of the mining companies just accessing and developing those resources that are, I think, on the ground? Mr. Quinn.
Thank you, Javier. Well, let me start with a little bit of perspective about where we are in terms of the role of mining in our society, or at least in our economy. I think I'll give you some metrics on that. In the booklet, I think, is on everybody's seat here. There's a chart that's really from the United States Geological Survey, which will tell you that raw materials produced by the mining industry a year ago was valued about $68 billion. And there's another $15 billion in the sector that's also extracted through recycling. So recycling is also a significant part of what we're engaged in. And that translates into about another $500 billion in intermediate product that's later translated into over $2.1 trillion in finished product in the United States, which is about 14% of our GDP. So clearly, mining has an important role in our overall economy and in terms of our economic security. At that point, the question really becomes, and in terms of what do we have here in the United States, our mineral endowment, our bench is very deep and very long. We probably have one of the richest mineral endowments on the globe, particularly if you compare it to the land mass of the United States. It's well above, significantly above the average for other countries. So there's a lot of potential, and the question really is, are we living up to that potential as a nation? And I think by several measures, the answer would be no, and we're slipping. First, in terms of value add to our economy, the United States continues to be one of the leading countries in terms of its mining sector's contribution to the value add. But we're slipping, and we're being overcome by China. But when we take the amount of capital investment back into the mining industry as a ratio compared to what our value add is, we continue to decline, and we rank below Russia, China, India, Chile, Australia, Canada, and other nations. And that particular trend is very troubling because it might suggest that it jeopardizes our overall GDP rank in the world if our capital investment back into a significant sector that has, for the value add of our country, is being underinvested in. Two other measures I'll just put out there for you in terms of the consequence of that underinvestment. One, we are twice as import dependent on minerals, critical minerals, today as we were about 15 to 20 years ago. So today we're 100% dependent on 18 critical minerals, whereas 20 years ago was only 9. And we're dependent on 50% or more on 42 critical minerals. And finally, the amount of budget we are attracting in the United States for expenditures in exploration for future mineral prospects is declining. It used to be in 1993 or so, about 20% of the global exploration budget was spent here in the United States, and today it's only about 8%. And that's a leading indicator where future capital investment will be, is those countries that are actually investing in finding new prospects. We do have, we can talk about later, some of the impediments we see from a public policy standpoint. The question is, and I think Colin and others can speak to, I think we're seeing Congress and some of the policymakers finally focus on these particular trends and hopefully bring a sense of urgency to it. But we have a lot of our wealth, mineral wealth, locked up in 12 western states, which is dominated by federal land, so therefore is influenced by federal land management policy. And almost half of those lands are either off limits or restricted to access for mining. We also have a very heavy regulatory burden. In the United States, it takes almost 10 years to get a project through the permitting system. And clearly the difference of value proposition is clear. If I can go take that capital, go to another country, and get those permits in 2 years, and I have clearly a much earlier return on my investment. So those are some of the impediments, but I thought maybe it'd start off with a little context of where mining stands in terms of its role in our economy and our society right now.
I appreciated that. Stephen, just turning to you, and I think that something that Hal said that I think is very important, and is how the U.S. is becoming more and more dependent on foreign supplies of metals and minerals. Is this a trend that troubles you when you are working at GE and you are looking at not only the products that you have to serve today, but also all the pipeline that you have of products looking forward? Is something that you having to import these from overseas makes you nervous?
Let me just put a little bit of background on this. So GE uses roughly 70 of the first 83 elements on the periodic table, somewhere in one of our products. And so...
What is the one that you use the most?
Iron.
Iron.
Very simple. Steel,
that's everywhere.
Right? Yes, absolutely. By weight, certainly.
And by value?
It's iron also.
You see, I was expecting something like gold or silver.
No, it's still iron. So when you're using that broad mix of elements, there will always be a challenge in one element or another that we need to be looking at. And I guess what really concerns us is the stability of the supply, not necessarily where it comes from, but the stability of the supply and predictability of the supply, as well as, of course, prices are a major aspect also. So as we look at where our priorities are in terms of the issues that we need to solve, we're clearly looking at stability of the supply and as well as the price dynamics.
So just to be sure I get it right, you are not very much concerned about if a material is coming from the U.S. or overseas, but what you really are troubled is if you think that overseas supply suddenly could change. It could be a drop in availability for any particular reason.
Yeah. And of course, we're a global company. We're manufactured globally, and so the materials will be coming from globally also. And really, what it is the stability of the supply.
Okay, Roderick, do we have enough here in the U.S. to sustain a growth of the industry? Is enough mineral endowment down in the ground that we can continue to develop the industry, or do we face a geological constraint that suddenly, we cannot expand the industry because we have been mining for so many years that the stuff is not there? Could you give us the expert view of what is on the ground and how the industry could develop over the next few years?
Okay. It's less of an issue of running out than it is of knowledge of the endowment and costs and other issues associated with producing that endowment. I would say fairly confidently that the United States has significant unexplored and undeveloped geologic potential, despite the long history of mining in the United States. Clearly, we're not going to become self-sufficient in the 70 of the 83 elements that GE uses. But I think there, to some degree, is lack of taking advantage of the potential that Hal mentioned, and I would identify two issues in particular. One, lack of public investment in the sorts of things that the private sector alone will tend to underinvest in. And so I'm thinking primarily about pre-competitive research throughout the material supply chain, starting with geologic information and on up through material science, materials engineering, and so on. But also including public investments in education and in the basic information that helps us understand geologic potential and market conditions. So that's one issue that I think we should discuss. A second challenge, and you alluded to this in your opening remarks, the challenge of efficiently and appropriately balancing and weighing the commercial, environmental, and social dimensions of mineral development. And I don't think we do a very good job, and by we, I'm thinking both about companies in the industry and also government and the regulatory permitting process. Not so much that the regulatory rules are inappropriate, although we should always be looking at re-examining the rules themselves. But I'm thinking primarily about the efficiency of the processes that we have that allow us to weigh the commercial, environmental, and social.
So what is the main problem? Is it too slow?
It's slow and it's unpredictable.
Because I'm sorry to refer back to my trip, but when I was in South Africa, the executives were complaining that it takes 2.5 years to get through all the licensing processes. And I was just thinking, well, that's a very long time. Indeed, one mining executive said, if I give you, we have a pretty good asset at the moment, all the geological studies are done, we give it to you, you get your lawyers, I get my lawyers, you pay $1, you are not going to be producing a single ton of mineral in 2.5 years, because that's where we are. Hal said it takes 10 years here. It's extraordinary.
I agree. Which is not to say that there isn't an important role for public participation and the evaluation of the environmental and social potential social problems associated with mining. But I think we need to work harder on the processes, the regulatory approval processes.
Yeah. Colin, going to Capitol Hill then on that process, do you see any change on that matter? And more broadly, do you see interest within the lawmaking community and the policy-making community here in the U.S. realizing the importance of the mining sector and how to work with the industry?
Well, I think the interest is increasing, and you mentioned the experience in the oil markets in the 70s and the realization that a raw material, a commodity, could be used as a weapon. I think that's generated a great deal of interest on Capitol Hill in the topic generally. And of course, it's not just one commodity, right? I mean, there are dozens and dozens of minerals where the U.S. is very heavily or entirely reliant upon foreign imports. It certainly helps that there are these poster children out there, rare earth elements in particular, where a great deal of journalistic attention paid, a great deal of defense and international relations implications associated with the behavior of the Chinese and other countries, both suppliers and buyers of those minerals. So there's a great deal of interest, evidenced by the number of bills introduced and the number of hearings that are being held. What's unique and somewhat refreshing about this topic is there's not as much of a partisan divide associated with it. Senator Murkowski introduced a bill a few weeks ago. There are now 18 co-sponsors of the measure, 9 Democratic senators and 9 Republican senators. And I think part of the reason there's as much interest and as much bipartisan enthusiasm for doing something to address the issue, not just the permitting issue you've raised, but the workforce training issues you've raised, the analysis and forecasting capabilities, something that really is an appropriate role for the federal government to be playing, is because this particular energy and natural resource issue differs significantly from what's dominated the conversation in recent years, and that's primarily this climate change debate, right? I mean, and there you have differentiation taking place between fossil fuels and everything else, and it's this sort of zero-sum game. There's a finite amount of market share to go around in the electricity sector and in the fuel sector, and to the extent that a ton of coal or a barrel of oil is being used to meet that demand, it is I think by many viewed as that's occurring at the expense of these alternatives that many people support. It's different in terms of the minerals, because the very technologies that we believe are sort of next generation and more efficient and cleaner rely entirely on these raw materials to exist. The solar panels, the wind turbines, even the advanced turbines, the material science that needs to be brought to bear for hydrogen-fired turbines and clean coal facilities. All of it relies on these minerals. So you have more of a sort of a symbiotic relationship between the two than a conflict. And I think that's led to, as I said, a great deal of interest on Capitol Hill, but it also requires legislators to be realistic about what the government can do to fix the many issues that are out there. And that's becoming more difficult by the day. The current fiscal situation, much of the policy measures we would traditionally bring to bear on this involve spending money. The workforce training programs cost money. Research and development conducted by the federal government costs money. And we are extremely limited in terms of our ability to bring those sorts of options to the table. The commodity prices themselves, right? I mean, price discovery isn't something that Congress typically gets involved in. And the timeliness of the response. I mean, it took years, decades to get into the situation we're in terms of this fairly overwhelming reliance on foreign supplies. And I know there's some question about just how problematic is that, and it does. It depends on where these resources come from. But it took time to get into the situation, and it's going to take time to get out of it. The one area where at least Senator Murkowski has tended to focus in terms of the federal government taking some actions to fix the problems we're up against in terms of the availability and reliability of these raw material supplies is the permitting process. The U.S. ranks dead last. You can only go up from there, right? I mean, something has to be done. And it has been she's consistently articulated as her view, the idea that, delaying projects and stranding capital and as a result, and because of the time value of money, making what should be sort of a part of a national security strategy, an economic strategy in the United States, making those projects that produce those raw materials uneconomic as a result. They don't just not happen here, they happen somewhere else. And they happen somewhere else where the 30-plus federal and state and local regulatory programs that we have in place to protect the environment, in many cases, just don't exist. So you're not only offshoring the production, you're offshoring the environmental impact. So I think there needs to be a conversation about environmental protection achieved through setting strict standards. And if operators are capable of meeting them, then it would seem to make sense to allow them to do business and invest in the United States. And if they're not, then I think they should look elsewhere or not be operating at all. And that seems perfectly reasonable, but it's highly problematic that the delays, not the inability to meet standards. I think many people are capable of meeting these standards, many companies, that the delays are what's really standing in the way. And 10 years is far too long. Now, Senator Murkowski introduced the bill I mentioned. The truth is that bill probably would not fix these delays, but at a minimum, it would require the provision of information that's necessary to make informed decisions about what to do about them. Things like, statistical representations of how long each step takes, recommendations about what can be done to sort of expedite or at least optimize the efficiencies associated with the consideration of permits. And that's something where clearly, the conversation is underway and on Capitol Hill. It needs to continue. There's some question about how robust the response will be, but at least generating the information is a valuable exercise. And of course, there's other areas, the workforce development issues, the trade issues, the defense implications, and if you get into trouble as a congressional staffer trying to handicap the likelihood of success, but I do think that even in the current environment, there is a very viable path forward for a legislative response, and one that hopefully, as we sort of continue again with the bills and the hearings and everything else, that will start to right the ship here and put us in a better position.
How strong is that momentum, and how linked is that the fact that we have very high prices for metals and minerals? I'm concerned that if by any reason prices just start to head south, some of that momentum could disappear. You think that is strong enough that it's just going to continue working?
Well, so I think the momentum's very strong, right? And it's because the raw material availability cuts across so many sectors of the economy. The Energy and Natural Resources is very interested in the deployment of clean energy technologies, right? But the Armed Services Committee is very interested in making sure the raw materials necessary for defense systems are available. Presumably, the Help Committee wants to make sure that the raw materials needed for medical imaging equipment are available at affordable prices. But in terms of the price and trying to forecast the price and make policy decisions around that, look, I just think we have to be very careful and realistic, as I said, about sort of the congressional role in all of this and the private sector role. Conversations about how efficiently or inefficiently permits are processed, that is a very reasonable conversation to have on Capitol Hill and in the committee's jurisdiction. I think that predictions of price and whether or not investments are worth pursuing is something that needs to be dealt with by the private sector. And assuming people are comfortable with that construct, and the federal government can do its part to facilitate investment, and the private sector can make decisions about whether or not it's worth making those investments, we'll be in better shape.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn to Frank Havney. And just with all your experience on policy making and national security, how do you see the dependence on foreign sources of minerals and metals? Is that a problem, or is something that is just part of the globalization and we need to get used to it and manage the best way that we can?
You said something earlier that I wanted to just take exception to. The problem is we're not dealing with people simply using these minerals as political weapons or as diplomatic leverage. I think they're at the very least putting themselves in positions to use them as strategic weapons. We cannot persist in a policy approach that we have to date, either as a national security sort of element of the government, or I think the government more generally, in which it seems to me we're playing by kind of a different set of rules than the rest of the world. You've mentioned the term globalization. That's kind of our mantra, and GE is a prime example of the phenomenon. And yet, I think, objectively, you see virtually every other country on the planet, or in some cases, groupings of countries like the EU, pursuing what is at the very least mercantilistic policies, maybe nationalistic. Certainly, in some cases, the Chinese come to mind, more colonialist than anything else. And they're not approaching this in a way that is conducive to our, I think, continuing to have the kind of confidence that we have as a country and as a Defense Department, most especially, that we'll always have access to whatever it is we need from wherever it is we get it at the lowest price. And that therefore we can safely depend upon those foreign sources of supplies, especially for products, as Colin was saying, that are vital to national security, as well as other parts of our economy in the energy sector and health and so many others. I happen to think that the United States government has for years, and this isn't a partisan critique, it's been true under both Republican and Democratic administrations, been derelict to the point of malfeasance when it comes to thinking that this can be sort of an open-ended reliance upon even countries that are demonstrably unfriendly to us and becoming more so by the day. And we're getting to a point now where, whether it's in the case of rare earth minerals or frankly in several others, energy, financing, access to space, these are just examples of an attitude that I think is irresponsible and going to cost us in strategic terms, not just in sort of political and diplomatic ones. So I guess I would conclude by saying it seems to me that at this point in time, it's imperative that the kind of interest that Colin is describing is taking place on the Hill go forward, yes, but be matched by a level of interest and commitment in the executive branch as well. If I could close with just one example of something that happened a couple of years ago. I'm sure those of you in the business know this better than I, but I remember testifying against the purchase by China of Unocal. And I think I was the only one to mention that there was this natty problem that Unocal would not only be turning over some significant, not huge, but significant energy resources to the Chinese, but they would also be giving them title to the Mountain Pass mine, which at that moment was basically the only working mine, and it wasn't all that working as I recall, but it was accessible. And had we done that, whatever it is, the 97% of the world's rare earth minerals that are now supplied, if they are, by the Chinese, would have been an even larger percentage of the world's actual capacity. So nobody was paying attention to that. Not in the Defense Department, as best I could tell, not in the White House, not on Capitol Hill, until these sort of larger issues of energy security sort of came to the fore. But it's simply a reminder. This isn't a problem, as Colin said, that has started yesterday. It has been with us for some time. I think we have compounded it by our indifference to the dangers, the vulnerabilities associated with dependence on especially unreliable, even hostile nations. And it's something we've got to remedy. And we'll presumably spend some time here talking about how best to do that. But I think there is an absolutely pressing national security argument, as well as for the larger economy, that we do that.
Thanks a lot. Why we don't take it from there? And can I ask you, Colin, do you think that there is that sentiment in Capitol Hill? Particularly, you said that the poster boy was rare earth, that's really what is catalyzing a lot of the movement.
We're getting there, I think. There are, on any given day, 101 things for a senator or a member of the House to be concerned about. We're approaching a debt limit, right? I mean, where are you going to put the debt limit compared to a reliance on foreign sources of rare earth elements, right? There are an awful lot of hearings going on, there are an awful lot of bills moving, and there are an awful lot of priorities competing for the bandwidth of elected representatives. But I do think, and even to the extent that some of these bills are not sort of silver bullet solutions to the problems we're up against, I do think it is incredibly valuable for them to be written, for them to be introduced, for hearings to be held on them. Because those hearings are catalysts for engagement with elected representatives, and it's the process that's ongoing right now. I mean, there are 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 hearings a week between the House and the Senate on this very topic, this fairly narrow topic compared to things like the debt limit.
Let me ask, not just on rare earth metals, but just on the whole minerals and metals industry, on those 101 topics that is worrying a senator on a given day. And if I ask you the average senator, where you will put the mining and metals industry on those 101 lists? It's just on the 20th?
Well,
it's on the 75?
If you confine it to the mining and metals industry, you're probably talking about senators, and it's most of them, with geological potential for the production of this stuff in their states. But even beyond that, and just assuming they probably have manufacturing in their state. They may very well have companies trying to invest in the creation of a recycling industry. I think all 50 states have some form of defense-related industries within their borders. So, I guess that's the learning curve, though, that is sort of being climbed at the moment. And I think it's demonstrated by the number, as I said, the number of bills that are being introduced, the number of co-sponsors that are joining in support, the attendance at the hearings that are being held, and I don't think at this point, thankfully, that it's confined to sort of just the production side of it. I think there's a much larger net that's being cast, and it's benefiting sort of the legislative process and the ideas that people are coming up with to fix the problem.
I think if you asked that question, whatever it was, 6 months ago or so, before the Chinese whacked the Japanese, you couldn't have found it in the first 100. Right. Suddenly it spiked because suddenly everybody's got a focus on it, and now it's back down because seemingly we're muddling along. The Chinese have relaxed things, I guess, a little bit, and you're on to other more immediate crises. But the problem is, if I think we're right here that this is a strategic problem, And it can get a lot worse in a hurry if people decide to take advantage of it to our detriment. Then you can bet that it's going to escalate it even further up. But the problem is that, as several of us have said, there isn't an immediate solution. So we've got to be fixing this problem as best and as urgently as we can, even though it's not top of mind, because it's going to take us a long time to do it.
Beyond rare earth metals, Hal, how do you see the conversation in Capitol Hill, and what else would you like to see that is at the moment not present on that conversation?
I think it's connecting the dots. I think it's almost like the energy debate for years. I mean, the level of energy illiteracy in this town was incredible, and I think we're going through the same cycle here in terms of minerals and materials, the foundation of our economy. It's been below the surface, and somehow we need to get it above it and say, here's where all the dots connect in terms of economic security, national security, prosperity. What are the hidden costs, whether it's national diplomatic hidden costs by saying we can still muddle through with dependence on some unstable supply chains at this point in time. We may still be able to maintain supplies of certain minor metals because we're making concessions in other parts of our foreign policy, whatever, and those things don't often come. Will we ever be totally self-sufficient? No, but we certainly can be a heck of a lot more sufficient here. And the other issues we talked to them about is it doesn't necessarily have to be a national security issue, though it is for all these metals. The fact of the matter is, if we can mine them here, and we can mine them competitively here, we get the benefit not only of high-wage jobs from extraction, but we help build the supply chain on the value added, and that's good. I mean, we've talked about before. If we were mining to our potential, and let's say on such metals as copper, iron ore, zinc, and others, we could have added $38 billion in revenue to our GDP, which would translate to perhaps another $1 trillion in the overall GDP in the finished product. So there's the benefit right there. I'm not saying let's bring uncompetitive operations online. I'm saying let's figure out what are the hurdles here. Why are we squandering the advantages we have in terms of mineral endowment, incredibly skilled workforce, top-of-class infrastructure when it comes to energy as well as transportation, and finally, we have very deep capital markets. So are we squandering all those advantages away based on some other public policy impediments, or perhaps even self-inflicted wounds by the industry itself?
Roderick, can we do that? Do we have those assets on the ground, and can we do it economically here in the United States, that production?
There's not a simple yes or no answer to that question.
That's what I always tell my editor.
As I said before, we have a significant amount of unexplored and undeveloped geologic potential. The starting point for assessing the degree to which this is unexploited is with what I described before, the pre-competitive evaluation and research, as well as workforce development of trained professionals, if you will, the institutional infrastructure that supports and facilitates mineral development. I think it's important to redirect the question a little bit and say, I think we should ask the question, what are the appropriate roles and responsibilities of the private sector versus government? I mean, how do we sort out what's appropriate for government to be involved in and what should be more hands-off? And I guess the way I approach the issue or frame the issue in my mind is around the following points. And maybe I'm showing my bias as an economist, but I have a bias towards liking markets and unfettered free markets, or the proposition that markets, if well functioning, do a lot of good things, and therefore that public policy should focus on trying to facilitate well functioning markets. And then you ask, well, what does that mean? And it means three things to me. One, in this regard, it means as I said before, public investment in those sorts of things that the private sector alone would tend to underinvest in, pre-competitive research, education, and information and analysis that Colin identified. Second, this whole efficiency of the permitting process, which we've talked about already. And then finally, and we haven't talked much about this, the international dimensions of mineral markets and minerals issues. For certain elements, and rare earths are the poster child here, a major part of the problem, it relates to international trade. And so there's an aspect of certain mineral problems that are appropriately tackled through trade policy. The other international dimension that I think it's important to identify is the idea of collaboration. We, GE, and we are not, we could be more self-sufficient in many minerals, but we're not going to become self-sufficient. We have many potential international collaborators, both among producing and consuming nations, and we ought to be taking advantage of and making sure that we develop diverse mineral supplies from where they can best come from, regardless of whether they're in the United States or not.
I want to take it from there, what you said about the collaboration between the public and the private, and also the private and the private sector, particularly talking about a consumer of metals and minerals and the mining industry. How do you see that equation? Do you see a scope for collaboration, a private collaboration, in which a company which needs the metals and the minerals could partner with miners just to get those minerals out of the ground?
Yeah, certainly. Actually, what I'd like to do is sort of give a little bit of a background on how manufacturers typically think about these issues. When a material is identified as being at risk through whatever process might be
Can I ask you, before you continue, and I don't know if you can answer this question or not, how many of your inputs do you see at risk?
Yeah, that's not a question I'm going to answer. That actually will come up in a minute, because I think this is a very important question that we need to understand, and we need to understand better. But when a manufacturer recognizes a challenge, there is a series of strategies that can be taken to solve an issue. One is very important to NMA is developing new sources of materials, and this is a very important part of the solution equation. But there are others. There are development of more efficient manufacturing processes that use materials more efficiently. There's also recycling, an important part of ensuring that we're using materials efficiently. There's also substitutions, and partial substitutions, whole substitutions, and then there's also system substitutions. There's often more than one way to solve a customer's need. So along with the very important source part, that's 5 strategies, and a company will look at the issue at hand and try and sort through those solutions, and oftentimes talks about and actively pursues more than one of those solutions. Okay, and so the very start of that process is understanding where the challenge is. Okay, and we can do that using the data that we have. For example, data from the USGS, very important in terms of understanding where the materials are. But one of the places that we're not particularly good at this time is understanding what the future uses will be. And of course, the way I answered your question is the way any customer, any company would answer that question. I can't tell you what materials we're going to use in 3 to 5 years, because I'm telegraphing to you, as well as our competitors, what sort of technologies we're going to go after. So we're not going to do that. But we know what they are, and we'd love to be able to share that with someone who can coalesce it from other major manufacturers and other manufacturers in order for us to be able to see in the future where things are going.
Do you have anyone on the executive branch of the government talking to you about that?
We, at this point, no. So that's one of the things that we're advocating. Once we have, because once you do this analysis and then you pursue one of these 4 or 5 solutions, it's a real challenge. I mean, there are solutions there that there are multiple ways. That's the station you want to get to, and there's multiple tracks to get there. And very often, a company will only have the wherewithal to take one of those tracks, and have to make decisions very, very early. This is another place in terms of what Rod was referring to, pre-competitive research. Trying to figure out which one of those 3 or 4 tracks to take down. That's very, very important, and that's where the pre-competitive research comes in for us to understand which one of those to go down. For example, in developing technology to recycle or in developing technology to do substitution. Very, very, very important to this situation in solving these problems.
Do you see a scope to private-private partnerships in the sense that you do off-take agreements with a miner that is developing a new project, so that miner knows that it's going to have a customer?
Generically speaking, the answer to that question is yes. And that is, when we pursue the solution that involves developing sources and developing mines, that's very, very important. And also is another place where this, being able to see around the corners, the future, helps, because now obviously that helps the mining industry to understand where the needs are going to be, and an important part of the equation.
I'm going to ask Hal to elaborate also more from the mining industry. How do you see that scope of collaboration with consumers? But before I do that, I just wanted to ask you, Frank, are you surprised what he said about that the government is not even asking the question?
Not really. I think it kind of tracks with my general thesis here, which is that I think it's not been enough of a concern to the government.
I mean, because
where it's getting its stuff, as long as it's getting its stuff.
If the government is not talking to General Electric, it's not talking to anyone.
Yeah. So
well, the president is speaking to Jeffrey Immelt this afternoon, I think, as a matter of fact, but maybe not on this particular subject, though I would be surprised if this is as high a priority as you suggest, that this doesn't come up, but it should. But the larger point is there in fact an institutionalized priority assigned to this in the government? It's not enough to have a secretary here or a secretary there, come on this at a whim, or for that matter, a senator do so. There has to be a priority assigned to it.
And you don't see that priority?
Missing. It's been missing, and I see no sign of it changing unless, we do decide that this is a completely untenable basis for conducting our national economic and security affairs.
You wanted to add?
Yeah. I should add that last year at about this time, the Department of Energy did put out a request for information for people usage of critical minerals in the energy sector, and we did in fact provide proprietary information. This is a great mechanism for doing that, and they were able to coalesce the information that they got into a
what you are referring to, you would like to see this more often happening.
Yeah, and more broadly. I mean, we need to be doing it for the Department of Defense and in all the departments that are using critical materials.
Mm-hmm. Hal, what do you see there as the scope of private-private collaboration with consuming industry, with manufacturing?
Well, I see a need, and there'll be transactions based on offtake agreements, some capital support arrangements, things along those lines. Never underestimate the commercial world and Wall Street to come up with mechanisms to fill the gaps there. Whether we see what would typically happen in other industries as a vertical and backward integration, I don't know. I'm not sure that's where that would take us, but I do see some more strategic partnerships looking out ahead. I think I won't name companies. I've already seen some of those come down in terms of the value-added part when it comes to permanent magnets, things along those lines, looking at the raw material provider, them reaching out to acquire some of the technology that's already out there that perhaps they lost to begin with, but now they're going to reacquire to add to the whole value-added chain there. I think the interesting discussion we just heard is about the private-public partnerships and the lack of institutionalization on that. There used to be some agencies that had bits of responsibilities. The Bureau of Mines was disbanded in the 90s due to government efficiencies. Department of Commerce has had a role, but I think it's been somewhat diminished over the years. Of course, Department of Defense. Now Energy, Department of Energy is more prominent. My experience has been is their interest is always episodic. It comes in, it's almost like a cycle, it's almost like a metals super cycle, you know? But if you're already reacting to it, you're too far behind. So I'm not sure whether it's institutionalization as well as a sense of urgency by the government to go to the business community involved, the sectors, and collaborate on planning and gathering information and then doing something about it, and then having the commitment to do something about it. But legislation is just to finish. Colin's working on. Congressman Lamborn has a nice piece of legislation as well in the House. That's the beginning, and we have to build on that. They won't necessarily solve all the problems, but they bring a sense of attention that if we can institutionalize it, these are important enough to stay with it when the prices drop down a little bit or the supply chain disruption ends momentarily. How do we continue to prepare ourselves that we've already hedged ourselves against those interruptions in the future?
I just wanted to add to the equation here a different kind of public-private partnership that's operating to exacerbate the concerns that I'm talking about. Namely, the Chinese, for example, saying that if you want to have access to their rare earth minerals, you have to bring your production capacity to China, and then you don't have to worry about quotas for exports. You're an internal industry. That is, as I understand it, Hal, beginning to have the tractor beam effect on some American companies moving there and exacerbating this problem that the sources of supply of things, including some of the finished products, not just the raw materials, are going to be coming from
I think that's absolutely right.
places.
It's a change in their business model, and it's, from their perspective, completely rational. If you control 97 or 95% of the supply chain, why are you going to settle for employing thousands of people to extract the raw rare earths? Why not go for employing millions of people who are not only going to refine it, but make the finished products, turbines, flat screen TVs, and so forth, that you export to other countries? That's exactly what we used to do in this country. The question is, can we reclaim that type of approach?
Yeah, it's perfectly rational.
But very dangerous.
But from our point of view, it's not healthy.
Right. I agree. I agree.
I'm going to open the floor for questions. So you have any questions, I could continue asking, and I would like to continue the debate, but I would like to hear from the floor if we have questions. If you could please identify yourself and your affiliation, please. The gentleman here on the first row.
I'm Evan Gaddis. I'm the president of the National Electric Manufacturers Association. And I don't know that this is as much a question as an endorsement of what I heard Frank Gaffney say. What I would add to that is that it's a strategic issue, but it's not business as usual. And that's the message we've got to get out here. I'm happy to see that domestically we've got Congress moving on this right now. I think we need to move it much faster. I totally agree we've got to get the executive branch moving. GE is one of our companies. There are 450 others. But as I look around here, and I have talked to probably every industry leader that I can in the last few months, I can't see a product in this room that doesn't use some type of a rare earth. And we're moving at this very slow. If I can give a comparison, if this were gasoline today and the consumer knew what is going to impact them, we are seeing 300% to 600% increases in the products that you're looking at here, your laptops, these lights, your rugs, or anything else. It is going to be like a tsunami hitting the consumer. We've got to move on this quickly. And I just want to get that message out there. They don't yet know what's happening, and our government is not acting quick enough.
This goes back to sort of the point that I was trying to make in response to your question about is it in the top 100 issues. When that tsunami hits, and it's a matter of time, especially if people take steps to exploit the vulnerabilities we're discussing, you bet this is going to be front of the consciousness of the Congress. It's just, will they be positioned to do something quickly about it? I don't know.
Or even at a basic level, will you have the information necessary to understand what you're up against? And,
this requires good staff work.
I mean, we talk about sort of the institutionalization of this stuff at the federal level, and there's the conversations ongoing on Capitol Hill, but there are also, we've sort of touched on what the Department of Energy has done with their critical material strategy, and the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the executive branch has spent a great deal of time looking at this too. But there's, within the U.S. Code, as a matter of law, this is not an institutionalized legal requirement of the executive branch to not only sort of solicit this information, but analyze it and attempt. Now, we have the Energy Information Administration for our energy commodities, and they attempt to forecast where things are headed. They don't always get it right, but the sensitivity analysis and the analytical effort is invaluable in terms of trying to make informed decisions about what the policies are going to be in the next year, in the next 5 years, in the next 10 years. And we just don't have it. And we can talk about what the solutions are, but until you have that information, you're really just kind of guessing. And I think one of the most important things, and to Steve's point, it's GE and no other company in their right mind is going to provide that information to a competitor. But if the federal government is legally required to protect proprietary information, to aggregate it, to withhold it at the request of the provider, that's just a vacuum that absolutely needs to be filled, and it can't be filled in a transient way at OSTP where there's turnover associated with each presidential administration, or sort of funding that comes and goes with appropriations bills and is competing. There has to be some requirement there, and I think that's one of the major first steps that can be taken.
More questions on the floor? No, at the moment. We have here in the first row a question, please.
Great, thanks. I'm Andrew Holland with the American Security Project. So my question is, there's a remarkable consensus on the panel here, but it's a good thing that we need to expand mining. But of course, the reason that it hasn't been expanded is because of environmental issues. The permitting process is slow because of environmental questions, and my question is to what extent has the industry overcome those old environmental problems, and what kind of new environmental issues are still ongoing? And it's not just about energy security. It's not just about economic competitiveness. It's also about keeping the environment in good shape.
Well, we made great strides in addressing some of our former legacy issues. I think our environmental stewardship on both air and water, material handling, rehabilitation of the land after mining. I think what we need to do is look at some of the policies that were created as a result of those legacies and say, do they need to be reviewed and how they are being applied today? There's a lot of redundancy in these laws and how they're administered. So we're looking at the same problem 4 or 5 times, maybe from different perspectives, but not all very productive perspectives. So there's some duplication there that can be worked out. There's also a lack of really accountability in the system. Not too many secretaries of the cabinet who have regulatory apparatus under them are getting job ratings because they've issued so many mining permits. But as soon as they issue a permit that seems to be controversial, both from a media standpoint and attention standpoint, there seems to be some major negatives attached to that without balancing it out and say, well, how much value added were you able to provide by permitting responsible operations and doing this in a balanced manner? I think that's Rod and others were talking about that too. I think we need to kind of examine that balance, and part of the legislation there deals with that. Now, there's a common misunderstanding or myth that companies will go overseas to invest because they're going to have lower environmental standards, and that's absolutely not really the case. Many of the domestic companies and the world global leaders, mining houses, export their environmental ethic to the host countries. And so this really, the competitive advantages aren't so much on the standards as much as it is in terms of how you're going to achieve those standards and what the process is in place to get you licensed and running.
Well, when you are talking to your counterparts elsewhere, overseas, are they approaching this problem in a different way? Are they suffering the same problems that you suffer here in the United States?
Yes, and some have already addressed it in Canada. On a provincial standpoint, many of them addressed it over a decade ago. They looked at all these laws and said, these laws were enacted 30, 40 years ago. Is this still the way to go? Is there more consolidation? They've looked at their tax regimes in terms of the burden overall, in terms of income taxes, sales taxes, royalties, and other types of fees, realizing that's the entire burden they need to look at, not just say, oh, our income tax is lower than these others, but if you're throwing on a number of other financial requirements overall that puts you at one of the highest corporate tax rates like we have in the United States, then there's another issue. And they have addressed it that way. And some are saying, as you were referring to earlier, they are bemoaning the fact that it still takes 2.5 years.
Yeah.
Well, we're trying to get through that curve to get to the 5 and 2.5 year level, and then we'll start another round after that.
Rod, could you comment on that also? How do you see different responses on different countries in terms of addressing increasing domestic supply?
I think there's a lot of, each country is different. I think the motivations behind specific mineral policies are different in different countries. The U.S. is unique, I think, in the degree to which it is both an important producer of many mineral commodities and an important user. If one looks at the European community, for example, most of their policy discussions, its policy discussions, have focused on securing the supply of imported raw materials. If one looks at countries like Australia and South Africa and Chile, the perspective is much more how do we facilitate more investment in the mining sector, and so I don't. And so in some sense, the policy environment is more unidimensional in many of these other countries.
Can we use our allies, the U.S. allies, for this matter? I mean, Japan was much more affected than anyone else on the rare earth metals. They see themselves as being extremely vulnerable, but so is South Korea, Taiwan, and obviously the debate also triggered a lot of comments in Europe. Do you see momentum on the allies, and can they be joining the U.S.?
Look, I think there are allies and there are allies. There are some that you may well feel that you can rely on with greater confidence than others. Canada comes to mind. Australia comes to mind. I remember, I think it was back in Desert Storm, we found ourselves needing, in this case, not minerals, but finished products or components, at least, from Japan for, as I recall, laser-guided bombs or some weapon system, flat screens maybe, and we simply had to get at the back of the queue, just like any other consumer. And we said, but there's a war on, and we're looking after your interests as well as ours, and I think in the end the government intervened to get us slightly better access. But it's a risk. My concern is if you were relying just on allies, it'd be one thing. You're relying on people who are hostile to you, whether it's the Chinese, quite obviously, or whether it's Bolivia or some of the others that are falling under Chavez's sway in Latin America, or perhaps some in Africa. This is a moment when an inventory of these dependencies and seeing what you can do. I think the point that several of us made, that diversifying sources overseas is a good idea. And if that's easier than diversifying them here, then there's an argument to be made if you're diversifying them with truly friendly people, that is a part of the solution. But I certainly think we're at a point now where, I don't know whether you call it an industrial policy or whether you simply call it a national priority, has to be established that says we want a greater capacity to be self-reliant in these critical areas where we do have the capacity to provide these materials ourselves.
Please.
If I could, Japan is an interesting part of this story. Japan recognized several years ago that there were challenges in the rare earths, and the EU has also done a study. Department of Energy has done a study. We've all come to the same conclusions that there are challenges here. But Japan is actually investing on the order of, it's been quoted a number of different ways, but on the order of $1 billion in investments in rare earth sources, as well as R&D to minimize their dependence on these elements, right? And including recycling. They are the leaders right now in developing these technologies, and there's no question of that, and it's that investment that's happening.
But the difference between Japan and the U.S. is that the U.S. doesn't need to invest overseas. The U.S. could invest for those developments here at home.
Right.
To some extent.
But my point is that if you look at those 5 solutions that I outlined, it is very clear that Japan is pulling on all 5 of those.
Well, and Japan has, the national government of Japan has taken it much more as a government responsibility to be at least involved in the discussion in, I think, a public-private partnership with a public-private partnership view.
Oh yeah, I mean, if I could add that, as a reporter, I was absolutely surprised about the involvement of very senior officials. I mean, it was not when they were briefing us on the impact of the de facto embargo that they were under China. It was not the undersecretary of policy, wherever, on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It was a very senior cabinet member who was briefing the media on what was the problem and what Japan was trying to do. So I will agree that it was really at the top of the government, the message. I mean, it was just cabinet ministers who were dealing with the problem. Can we resolve the problem just stockpiling? I mean, rare earth metals consumption is not so great, and other critical metals and minerals, we can try to build stocks. Will be that, I mean, and we have done in the past. Can we try that and as a way of addressing the needs of America in the 21st century, just as we have done with oil, with the SPR?
Let me take a first crack at that. And I guess, personally, I am at best ambivalent about government involvement in stockpiling. And on the one hand, for a user of an important input, stockpiling is an essential approach to among the range of options that a user can use to really buy its own insurance. But just because users may find it appropriate to buy insurance in the form of a stockpile, I think our experience in the United States with the government acting on behalf of both itself and private users has not been terribly good with stockpiles. I'm not so familiar with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve as with the National Defense Stockpile of metallic minerals and other mineral raw materials. And I think there our experience has been that actions tend to distort the markets, government actions on buying or selling, and that over time the government stockpiles have really not responded in a timely manner to changing requirements. And so what's stockpiled doesn't match what we need to have insurance for.
Hal, what's the view of the industry?
Well, we don't have a direct position on that. I think, for defense purposes, they may have a role. I'll defer to Frank on that. From an economic standpoint, stockpiles might provide a slight buffer for short-term interruptions, but it really doesn't address your long-term fundamental issue.
As with SPR, you want that to have it for a buffer, but what you want is local production.
Right, exactly. It's not going to last you that long, and it becomes a political football anyway. But I think saying for each commodity has its own story, and a stockpile, particularly for defense purposes, might make sense for certain commodities, but it's certainly not a solution to the larger issues I think we've talked about today.
Frank?
Well, I do think it does make sense in some respects. I think that the point is taken that you need to manage it so that you're not stockpiling enormous quantities of stuff that there really isn't a need for. I'm intrigued and attracted to the idea that if you can find workarounds for the resources, that can minimize the amount of stockpiling you need to do. But I think as a tool for, somebody used the term buffering, the problem that we currently have now, yes, it will distort markets if you can get access to the stuff in the first place. It will incentivize production in places where it doesn't currently exist, presumably. But it does bring you back to Colin's problem, which is where's the money to do it? And the only way I can see the money is available is if you realize what the costs, as we were hearing about a moment ago from the general, the costs are going to be if you suddenly find you just don't have access to the stuff you need.
Colin, is any movement on that sense on Capitol Hill, and is there any money?
Well, I guess Senator Murkowski chose not to include stockpiling provisions in the bill that she introduced, and personally, I think it was a wise decision. I think.
Why?
I think when you need to stockpile, it's too late. The best time to stockpile is when prices are low and there's no problem, and it's not a big deal to be drawing down the market supply of the resources.
Prices are 600% up. So.
But when it's a problem and when there's attention being paid, it's likely because there's a supply restriction or there's a price spike, and most of the time the two come in combination with one another, and that's not a time to be taking material that people need for products they're making off the market to sit in a government warehouse somewhere. And now, just as a general matter, in terms of the fiscal situation we're in, is not a time where there are resources available to make those expenditures. And the costs you incur by virtue of acquiring these resources and maintaining them and storing them could very quickly overtake the benefits of engaging those activities. And to Hal's point about this sort of political football phenomenon, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is, I'm sure, a very unpleasant thing to have to manage when gasoline prices are high. It's a highly subjective decision as to whether or not, on the continuum of crises, consumer pain all the way through to, military conflict resulting in supply. I mean, there's good luck to you. I mean, that is not a pleasant decision to be confronted with, and I think politically there are liabilities that accompany the creation and maintenance of these things that put up against sort of all the other issues just might make it not worth it. Now there are some unique materials, and we've got defense stockpiles in place. The Department of Energy maintains a uranium stockpile, largely as a legacy of the Cold War and the existence of those materials largely as a result of government activities. But it may be that in very narrow circumstances it's warranted, but I think we have to be very careful and very analytical about the specific material in question before we go down that road.
I was going to ask you about the view of the private sector. I mean, if the government doesn't stockpile, would you stockpile?
Well, we refer to them as inventories, right? And there is a sort of important distinction because we will turn that inventory over, right? And we use it as one of the tools. We bin that in the sources tool. And it's an important tool to buy time in order to implement others of these solutions, such as the sort of next nearest term solution is optimizing your manufacturing and making sure that you're not wasting.
So it's a bit of a buffer also.
Yeah. I mean, it is an insurance for those situations where you need to buy time for other solutions to come in.
I'm going to ask you something, but you may not want to respond because I'm not the executive, and I'm not going to keep this proprietary. But are you increasing your inventories?
Our inventories are based on an analysis almost day by day in some cases, and it responds to the market conditions.
You see, I'm
Javier, if I could just make one more observation. The notion that you would ever even need a stockpile is largely irrelevant if you have a production capacity and companies capable of responding to price shifts and to changing the ore grade that they go after or don't go after. The problem is that we don't for many of these minerals. We don't have a production capacity. But if we did, it's the functional equivalent of a stockpile, right? I mean, so if you can, as much time and effort and resources you might put into the creation of a stockpile, if we could just focus that on some of the sort of longer-term questions of material availability, I think
increase domestic production just
largely
resolves the problem of inventory.
Increase the feasibility of domestic production. I mean, the government itself isn't going to flick a switch and increase production, but the government is certainly in a position to make the United States a more attractive place to invest in those kinds of activities.
Real-time delivery, that's the best inventory right there.
Well, it's very similar talking about oil. I mean, Canada has very little reserves of oil, not like the United States with the SPR, but obviously Canada has a huge local domestic oil production that if there is a trouble, they just ramp up production and that's it. But can we, Rod, can we be analyzing this wrongly? I mean, can we be making a mistake because we are looking very, very much on the short term? I'm just thinking when all the problem of rare earth metals happened, I was talking to a minor metals trader and say, oh, this remembers me of the scare of tin. When in the 50s and 60s we thought in the United States we were going to run out of tin because of the spread of communism through Southeast Asia, and we start stockpiling tin. And then we spent like 30 years trying to run down those inventories of tin. Do you see that as a potential analogy, or really this time is different?
In terms of stockpiles?
Well, in terms of stockpiles and also in terms of being concerned about increased dependency of foreign sources of metals and minerals.
In terms of public policy in this area, I think government should be focused on the longer-term issues as opposed to the short-term issues. And if private users want to and find it useful to increase stockpiles as a buffer, as an insurance policy to deal with supply risk, I think more power to them, and that's perfectly legitimate. But I'm not sure that it's something government...
But you would like the government to focus more on the long-term structural problems of why the industry is not developing?
That's right. The longer-term issues of pre-competitive research, what I would call information and strategic analysis, education, and also the efficiency of the permitting process that we talked about.
Could I just ask a follow-up question? Your question seemed to imply that we could find ourselves in a situation where rare earth minerals are the equivalent of tin. And I would ask the experts in the field whether there's any probability of that, given what you know or will be willing to share at least in terms of substitutes, and what we see in terms of the reliance on a whole host of industries on those rare earth minerals.
Could you?
Yeah, the jury is still out on that one. But it's an interesting point. I mean, there was tin, and then there was tantalum, and then there was rhenium. You can name significant fractions of the periodic table that have
come and gone.
Yeah, and although in the case of rhenium, I mean, this is a case that affected General Electric, and we learned from that. We learned that in the case where you have a constraint on a material, that you do need a spectrum of solutions. There are solutions that do involve with the mining, but there's also we do more recycling now of rhenium. We have developed alloys
for the people on the road that maybe not be very familiar with rhenium. Why you don't explain a bit what was the problem, and is the one that you use for the engines on aviation?
Right. So rhenium is used at about 3% in some really critical superalloys for high temperature parts, the parts of the engine that make it more efficient, more clean burning. And what happened was there was a very gradual, in some cases maybe not so gradual, increase in the need for rhenium for use in that application. Obviously used in jet engines for both commercial and defense applications. And in the mid zeros, around 2005, 2006 or so, the price of rhenium went up dramatically. The availability was tight. We recognized, in time, it turns out, but still fairly late, that we needed to act. And the solutions that we went after were developing an alloy that uses half as much rhenium, that can then be used in the engine. Developing processes where we could take the rhenium that ended up as scrap on our manufacturing floor, recycle that and get that rhenium back. Develop programs where we could take blades off engines and reuse that metal and reuse the rhenium. And also develop, with our partners in terms of our suppliers of rhenium, better processes for efficiently extracting rhenium. So all of this came together to, this was a classic case of a constrained material, and we put together this strategy to overcome this. And as we stand today, the situation is much more relaxed, shall we say.
In a way, that the price increase of rhenium was related to the price increase of oil. As aviation companies wanted more efficient engines, it was almost the law of unintended consequences. That
the technology drove us in that direction, to use these higher temperature alloys that allowed us to build more efficient engines.
As you could see, I feel when I'm covering the subject as I was back to chemistry school in high school, and obviously feeling myself as I was again the pupil, and the teacher is explaining me.
But it's back to the original comment that these things have happened time again. Now the question is are the rare earths different? I think the jury is still out on that one.
Okay, very much appreciated. We are running out of time, so if there is any questions on the floor, this is your opportunity. If not, I will ask Hal if you want to say anything as final remarks on a bit of summary of the panel, but also you have policymakers on the room, you have professional staff. What would you like to see if anyone is taking a message home? What is that message you want to be?
Well, I think the message is this: is that clearly we have an issue in terms of our capability here in the United States. We have the potential. We need some thorough review of our policies in this country to assure that we can work to our potential, perform to our potential in terms of the mineral industry. Every commodity may have a different story in terms of what its criticality and what's the reason for that. But the bottom line is many of the solutions we need for having a more prosperous domestic mining industry, the solutions are oftentimes going to be the same. Better efficiencies in our regulatory process, access to where those minerals are located here in the United States. And while we might be able to have differences of opinion on the national security aspect of particular commodities or so forth, the message I like to leave is that, by and large, if we can mine them here competitively, then we're all better off as a country, because it's not only just the mining jobs we create, it's the value added, and we're in the beginning of the supply chain, so we can build out a more robust value-added supply chain in the United States. As we're talking about revitalizing our manufacturing capacity in this country, well, we're at the beginning of the chain, and we ought to all plug in together and get down that road.
To end on a very positive note after the comments, I will say that just the fact that we are having this debate, I think is very positive. It's a realization from the industry, but also from the public sector and the media, that there is a problem, that it needs to be addressed. And I think that mining and the whole natural resources sector is gathering a lot more attention. I mean, in the past, when it was that a newspaper, a national newspaper, carried a mining story on the front page, it used to be because it was an accident, or it was because it was an environmental problem. Today, more and more, we are seeing more stories about the challenges of the industry, the supply of critical commodities, and I think that this trend is very well going to continue. I'm going to say thank you to our panel for their time, their presence, and their expertise. Thank you to you for your time today in Washington, attending this conference, this executive forum, and please join me to say thank you to the panel. Thank you very much. And now please join us for a reception cocktail where we can continue the dialogue and we can have some time for networking. Thank you very much.